When I walked into the ballroom, the chandeliers were doing their best to outshine the past. Crystal droplets caught the late afternoon light and threw it back like tiny, expensive suns. The marble floor had been buffed to a mirror gloss. Servers moved through the crowd with the practiced invisibility of people who know where elbows don't belong. Someone had arranged orchids in towers, and the scent of lemon meringue and aged scotch braided through the air. It was the kind of scene you see in magazines, flat and perfect and measured in inches of linen. They clapped for my father, of course they did. After 42 years at the foundry, after a lifetime of turning late nights into steady paychecks for a city that believed in hard work, he deserved applause. He had a smile that crinkled the way it always did when he tried to be modest and failed. He wore a jacket that fit like a man who'd earned his tailoring. Guests drifted to him like planets around a quietly generous sun. And then, in the exact moment the band softened and people leaned in for a good story, I heard a whisper right behind my shoulder. "Look at her," said the woman whose voice could have been poured from silver, cool, practiced, the kind of hone you learn at enough private schools. "Isn't she charming? A bit country, don't you think? Funny that she even shows up." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The two syllables, country girl, were offered like a garnish, small and meant to be ignored, a social knife, polished and pointed. People laughed with the woman. They laughed as though the laugh would do the work of acceptance. My mother smiled toward whoever had made the remark, as though approval were a coin to be traded for belonging. My brother clapped a beat late, oblivious to the edge. My father kept telling the same joke about the first truck he owned, and everyone prepped their chuckles to match. I could see the woman better than she could see me, the pale heels that cost a small month's rent in her neighborhood, the discreet jewels that glinted just enough to be admired, the poised chest that said she expected her class to be noticed. It would have been easy to let it go. It would have been the expected script. Stand quiet, take the slight, own it with a banal joke later, let the wine loosen the sting. But here's what they didn't know. The ballroom they stood in, the chandeliers, the perfectly ironed linen, the servers with their subtle black ties, this place belonged to me. Not in the way gossip thinks belonging, not because I had bought it to spite them or because I wanted to parade it in front of their noses. I had built it. I had cleaned its kitchens and polished its glasses when I was barely 20. I'd learned to read balance sheets the hard way, in the margins of long nights and whispered tips. I knew the difference between gross revenue and net profit. I could tell you which local vendor skimped on butter and which one skimped on trust. That ownership wasn't a secret in the practical sense. People in my industry knew Birch Hospitality's name. But to my family, to the table of people who had laughed and swirled their champagne, it was a hidden fact. To them, I was still the girl who left at 18, who didn't come back enough, who had been strong in the stories to soften my mother's conscience. I was background music. The whisper landed like a stone. It would make a ripple in any pond. For a second, something inside me tightened. My hands had gone steady, the way they do when you are accustomed to moving through kitchens in the dark and you know exactly how the edges will line up. There was a small smile on my face, a private smirk, because I knew how the scene actually read. A woman in hot shoes mocking someone who could trace every seam in that ballroom with her eyes closed. I let the laugh lapse. I let the band put another song under my father's next anecdote. I bowed my head to the applause, kissed my father's cheek, made the requisite jokes about retirement. People leaned in to shake his hand and congratulate him. They didn't notice I was counting names in my head. Names of hotel managers, names of accountants, names of investors who had believed in me when my own brother had rolled his eyes. Names mattered. Details mattered. Ownership mattered in the quiet way that makes contracts and promises enforceable. There was an heirloom on my left, heavy in gold, lying in my mother's lap. My grandmother's necklace, the one she'd promised to me in private, the one they all knew she'd meant for me, had been put out in the open with the same careless ceremony as the champagne. My mother wore it like a trophy from a life she retailed to anyone who asked. When I had been a teenager, Grandma had pulled me aside and pressed that necklace into my hands like a benediction and said, "When you're ready." I had been too young then to understand the weight of promises. I left town instead, carrying that promise like a compass. Tonight, my mother had taken the necklace off and handed it with a small flourish to the woman who'd called me country. It was a performed inheritance, anointing the woman who had stepped into our orbit like a moth around a lamp. "To remember the occasion," my mother said, voice a little thick with the need to feel admired. The woman accepted it, her fingers soft and practiced, and slid it over her own throat like someone trying on the badge of a life she had not earned. I felt something that was not quite surprise and not quite fury. It was a small, cold heartbreak. The realization that everything I had done quietly, the transfers sent to cover a mortgage the family pretended was paid by someone else, the checks left uncredited, the phrase "from a friend" that had been used to disguise what I thought of as duty, had been misread or rewritten into someone else's story. My father caught my eye across the room. He said my name like he was surprised he had one. He seemed pleased. He had a way of assuming the best about people. He did not know about the checks under the table. He did not know about the nights I had sat in my office and tightened an expenditure so we could cover a leak in their roof. He thought we were all right, because that had always been his way. Assume the best and life will prove you right. I moved through the crowd like someone in a play who knows her lines but wants to improvise. I smiled at old friends. I hugged a woman who sold me linens when I was opening my first small hotel. I stopped by the bar and took a sip of something Scotch adjacent, and then left it on the ledge. I didn't want to drink away the sharpness. I wanted to keep my head clear. "Beth?" Wesley, my general manager, appeared at my elbow as if on cue. He had a way of looking at people that made them feel seen without being exposed. He'd been in my world since I hired him as a line cook 10 years ago, and then watched him become the quiet backbone of a brand I had worked to make presentable. Wesley wore a shirt without a collar, and the kind of calm that doesn't need announcement. "He's happy," I said, nodding toward my father. "He deserves it," Wesley agreed, but his eyes flicked to the woman wearing the necklace. In his face was a note I have learned to trust, curiosity threaded with unease. "Did Mom really—" "Yes," I said, and there was no need to finish. We both watched the woman laugh at whatever sent her glittering enough to make the table near us chuckle. This is where I should have left it. This is where the story could have been the quiet, painful thing many stories are. Someone taking something small and making a careless decision, and the hurt settling in like dust. But life doesn't stop at poetry. Life moves, and sometimes the movement reveals the seams. Halfway through my father's speech, when he was talking about the early days and the long nights, and how the townspeople had kept him honest, a man at a nearby table got to his feet, an investor, someone who had once lent me money when a contractor tried to close a project over an unpaid bill. He told a story about my father that made us all laugh, and then brought us back to tears about duty and work. The band rose, glasses were lifted. While the room swelled with affection, I felt a weight in my pocket. A text, a string of numbers from Naomi, my favorite forensic accountant, who I had called earlier that afternoon for reasons I wasn't ready to explain. It could have been innocuous, a confirmation, a question, but the message was as hesitant as she is precise. "Do you have a minute? Call me. It's odd." I put my phone away. I didn't call her in the middle of a speech. I waited. Because there's also another kind of silence at events like this. Corridors where staffers step away to smoke or take a breath. Service doors that lead to the mechanical heart of a hotel where the real work happens. Places where people think their words are private because they are hidden by a refrigerator door. I know those corridors. I had scrubbed them as a kid who wanted to be clean of more than dirt. I exited through the service door to the hallway, where the light is always harsher and the smell of bleach settles into the tiles. It was quieter out there, the band a distant thud, laughter like a radio through a wall. I leaned against the cool plaster and pulled Naomi's name up. "Naomi," I said when she answered. She sounded thin, like she had been chewing on paper. "What's up?" "Beth," she said, voice folding into the low hum of her apartment. "I dug into a name. I wasn't supposed to. I went in because a bank feed seemed off. It's complicated." "Talk to me." "There's a pattern," she said. "Accounts wrapped around each other, transfers that circle back through shell companies, payoffs that are listed as consulting but the dates line up with the events you've been hosting. Lots of small deposits that add up into a big picture. I can email you the highlights, but..." "But what?" I asked. The hallway suddenly felt shorter, a throat. "But there's something else," Naomi whispered, and the word made my skin goosebump. "Names that look like aliases. It's almost a classic Ponzi structure in quiet, thin layers." I didn't like the word Ponzi. It feels like a cartoon of criminality, an image of men in cheap suits and sham investments. In reality, it's uglier. People stealing promises, using community and trust as fuel. My stomach tightened into the familiar efficiency of someone who does hard things for a living. "Give me the names," I said. Naomi sent a list. 2 were immediately familiar, names that had been applauding my father, laughing, shaking hands. A 3rd was the woman with the necklace. A 4th was a name I'd seen once in a contract from a year ago, an intermediary who had facilitated a charitable donation that had been quiet in our accounts. The trail threaded through charities and companies and individual payables, like a map with a trail of breadcrumbs. "How deep?" I asked, because there was no point in pretending this was a small crookedness. "Is anyone in our family implicated?" "Not yet," Naomi said, "but there are connections to the local philanthropic network, donations, sponsorships. The interesting part is the way money flows out of shell accounts and ends up in..." She stopped, sounding like someone checking to make sure she hadn't said too much. I closed my eyes. The ballroom noise was muffled, but when I opened my eyes, I saw again the woman with the necklace, the way she had laughed at my mother's story. The picture didn't fit the elegant script of a retirement party. It looked like a performance staged to prop up a network of people who fed each other with false numbers and polite compliments. "Send everything to Rebecca," I said finally. Rebecca Thornton had been my lawyer since year 3 of running the business. She was the person I trusted to translate messy human things into terms that made sense on paper. A balance sheet, a subpoena, an affidavit. "And hold everything until I get back." "Beth," Naomi said, "if this is what I'm thinking, you need to be careful. These aren't small-time scammers." "I'm careful," I told her, which wasn't exactly a reassurance. It was a fact. Care had been a currency I traded in for years. Careful hiring, careful accounting, careful corners where necessary. "Wesley and I will look at the AV, the event feed. If anything strange shows up, I want timestamps, I want copies, I want chain of custody." "Okay, Beth." And Beth, watch your back. She didn't have to say it. I knew the kind of attention that followed someone who starts poking at other people's bookkeeping. But I also knew the value of being the sort of person who didn't shrink from inconvenient facts. I walked back into the room 12 minutes later with a face deliberately neutral. The band had started an instrumental version of Lean on Me, and people were lining up to say words that meant something. My father caught me first and squeezed my hand as if to anchor me to something steady. "You look tired," he said. "Long week," I lied. It was mostly true. The week had indeed been long, but it was a lie shaded with omission. The woman with the necklace nodded to me from across her table, a small motion of acknowledgement. I nodded back. She didn't know that the person she had been smiling at had just found a map of her life in bank records. She didn't know that I had a list of names on my phone. After the formal speeches wound down and people wandered toward coffee and the open bar, I found my brother Garrett by the coat check. He had the classic ease of someone who had never been required to earn a thing with blood and hours and sleepless nights. He was the golden child in the eyes of my mother, a man who could do no wrong in the family lore because he smiled with an ease that made people assume competence. "Beth," he said, clapping me on the back with that infuriating affection, "can you believe 42 years?" "I believe it. He worked hard." Garrett grinned, like hard work was a romantic notion he had inherited secondhand. "You should be proud of him. We all are." "You should talk to Mom," I said, because the necklace was still a raw thing. "That was Grandma's. She meant it for me." "You left, Bee. You made your life." He said it kindly, but there was a note there, as if the fact that I had been forced out into the world absolved my mother of any awkward economics. "Do you ever think maybe leaving didn't mean disappearing?" I asked, and he blinked. "You're cryptic at parties," he said, half amused. "Are you going to toast Dad? You should. People like your speeches." I smiled politely. "Maybe later." I had to be careful with him. Garrett would rather be liked than accurate. He liked peace more than truth. That made him good company at a barbecue and less helpful at the moment when facts needed to be faced. Still, I wanted him on my side because this scandal, if it was a scandal, touched the edges of our family. It used our hospitality as a backdrop. It used our faces in its ledger columns. Getting Garrett to notice would be easier than getting our mother to admit she had been dazzled. Wesley found me near the dessert table and slid a small envelope into my hand like it contained nothing but linens. Inside was a printout, a summary Naomi had sent when my phone decided that 12 messages were not something it wanted to handle live. There were 3 names on the sheet, the woman who'd laughed, 2 men from the philanthropic committee, and a note, "Transactions, unusual." "It gets messy," Wesley said quietly. He had the practical eye of someone whose livelihood depended on anticipating problems. "If they're laundering through charities, that complicates things legally, but it also gives them a stage. Retirements, donors, luncheons, lots of legitimate events to cover illegitimate transfers." I nodded. The legal complications were part of it, but the human complication was worse. My mother had been used as accessory to a lie because someone had wanted to appear more closely connected to a retiring man with a name like my father's. They had wanted the notoriety of proximity, the social pull of being in the right picture. "Do you want me to wait outside?" Wesley asked. He didn't need to be in conversation with members of the philanthropic committee, but he could slip into staff spaces without creating suspicion. "Yes," I said, "and tell the AV tech to hold the night's recording files. No one touches them." "Already on it," he said. "I called Marco. He owes me for the time you let him take the chandelier down for repairs." There is a peculiar advantage to owning the place where your world's ritual takes place. You know who moves the cameras. You know who can lock a file server. You know where the backups live. None of it is glamorous. Most of it is small habits and contracts and people who keep their mouths shut in exchange for a steady job. When you need help, that quiet ledger of favors becomes practical currency. That night, as my father laughed and people made toasts about legacies and the beauty of retirement, I was collecting breadcrumbs. Naomi texted again. The money trail had a pattern, monthly deposits labeled as consulting that matched the dates of donor dinners where my mother had sat at the table with the woman now wearing her own bones. Rebecca sent an email with a single line. "If there's anything here, we need to build a firewall. Names, timestamps, custody. Don't make waves before we're ready." "What's the plan?" Wesley asked. He had a way of pruning a problem into its manageable parts: evidence, access, reveal. I closed my eyes for a breath. On the inside, I was the kid who had slept at the back of a banquet hall on a folded cot between shifts, the girl who had learned to notice the way people buttered their words to mask debt. The years had taught me to move slowly when someone expected me to burn. "We gather everything quietly," I said. "We don't accuse anyone until we have a paper trail that holds up. We coordinate with Rebecca and Naomi, and then," I looked up at Wesley, into his steady eyes, "we choose where and when to show it." "At the party?" he asked. "At the party," I said. The idea felt right in my mouth, the way a brimstone edge fits a lighter. "This is a retirement party built on my company's schedule. We control the screens. We control the feed. If people are going to stand in a room and talk about legacy, they will be reminded what legacy actually looks like." "It's bold," Wesley said. "It could go sideways." "Everything could go sideways," I replied. "But if we don't do it, if we let them walk away with a necklace and a few handshakes and their names clean, we enable them to continue. This isn't just about exposure, it's about protecting the town." He nodded, the way a good ally does. His loyalty had been forged in heat and labor, the kind that says you stand in the line of fire not for glory, but because you know too well what it means when good work is stolen. There are practical things to do in a plan like this. The AV system is a puzzle of permissions and access. The party's slideshow runs from a laptop that sits behind the scenes. The feed can be switched. The timing has to be precise. Evidence must be presented in a way that is comprehensible to anyone with a pulse. Bank transfers translated into slides, plain language explanations, photos of signatures side by side. You can't throw a person into the middle of an accusation and expect the audience to do the detective work for you. You must walk them through the steps with clarity and restraint. Rebecca called me later that night when the balloons had been hauled away and the staff had simmered down to their post-event routines. Her voice was brisk and efficient, the person I hired for the temperament of a lawyer who doesn't moralize, but does make sure things are airtight. "Don't do anything rash," she said, which was not a warning but a framing. "We have to maintain chain of custody. If evidence isn't logged properly, defense counsel will eat us for breakfast. I want Naomi to document every copy and timestamp, and I want affidavits ready from Wesley confirming the integrity of the AV master file." "I have them," I said. "And Naomi? She's good, but be careful who knows what. If you go public too fast, they'll burn the trail. If you wait too long, the money flows deeper. We need to pick the moment where the evidence is undeniable and where law enforcement is ready to act. If this is as big as you suspect, I will reach out to an agent I know. But no, not yet. We need to be certain." I told her about the necklace. Rebecca's silence on the line was not for lack of response, but because she was thinking in legal choreography. "Symbolism matters," Rebecca said finally. "If you plan this in public, make sure the narrative is careful. We want responsibility, not trophy claiming. Keep the focus on facts." "Always," I said. It was a promise to myself as much as to her. When I finally went home, the house felt like a borrowed thing. I live simply now, in a small place with a window that looks out on a tree that will never be trimmed into submission. My office is a room that smells faintly of coffee and paper. On the wall, a framed photo of my first hotel opening sits in modest black and white, a ribbon cut with people who cared then, and a handful of staff who looked back as if they believed anything was possible. I sat at my desk and opened the files Naomi had sent. There were transactions that read like a language someone wrote to confuse outsiders. Small deposits, transfers disguised as refunds, payments to accounts that were later drained into personal checks. There were receipts for catered luncheons that had never happened, and invoices for consultancies paid to shell companies that didn't have physical addresses. A lifetime of small thefts stacks into something large if you follow the path. Money moves like water, redirected through pipes until it reaches a tank someone has hidden. My job now was to find the valves and label them. I thought about the necklace on the woman's neck, heavy and gold. Grandma had wanted it to have me when she imagined a future for me, one where I might need a reminder that someone believed in me before I believed in myself. My mother had given it away because she wanted the proof of being part of something bigger than her small afternoons. The necklace itself had value, sure, but what it represented, trust, promise, heritage, was what had been violated. I could have confronted my mother then in the blunt, accusing way that family arguments sometimes happen. I could have stood in the doorway and demanded explanation. But there is a difference between punishment and accountability. I was not interested in public shaming for the sake of a spectacle. I wanted to correct a wrong, to protect the town and the legacy my father thought he was celebrating. That meant a plan that left no room for doubt. I texted Rebecca and Naomi in one go, then Wesley, laying out a simple grid: collect, document, secure, coordinate. No public statements, no social media. Let things move like a controlled burn so we would own the perimeter. Rebecca replied with legal precision. Naomi sent a list of touch points. Wesley confirmed he'd secured the AV originals. There was comfort in the small banalities of logistics, the things that felt like work and therefore like hope. If there is a secret pleasure in being underestimated, it's that people reveal their masks in predictable ways. They assume they can perform identity, and no one will check the ledger. The woman with the necklace had, with a flick of a smile and a well-placed compliment, purchased a social currency she'd hoped would carry her into respectability. What I planned to do was not to ruin her life out of spite. It was to expose the mechanism that let anyone buy that kind of false belonging. But even as I plotted, I felt the thin thread of doubt. This kind of action rips at families. People will be embarrassed. My brother might feel betrayed. My mother might feel humiliated. These are human costs that are not negligible. I had a choice: preserve appearances at the cost of enabling theft, or show the truth at the cost of pain. I chose the latter because the alternative felt like complicity. I also chose it because beyond the ledger and the criminality was something simpler and colder: the idea that people could take what they wanted from others' reputations and rewrite history with a few well-placed donations. That was the thing to stop. We worked into the night. Naomi's reports multiplied into documents with highlighted lines and arrows. Rebecca wrote a note outlining what sort of pretext would be needed to request transactional records if we had to subpoena. Wesley stayed in touch with Marco in AV and found a way to duplicate the night's feed without anyone knowing. I called my father early the next morning to say I loved him and to ask if he wanted breakfast. He said yes, unaware of the small storm I was starting to raise for his protection. He believed in you, he said, like he always had. It felt like both a blessing and a plea. When I hung up, I looked at the framed photo on my wall and thought about the woman still wearing my grandmother's necklace at my father's dinner. In my mind, I started drafting the way the reveal would look. The slide would show a table with dates and transfers, side by side with photographs that had occurred on those same dates. Captions would be plain and unornamented. There would be no scream of accusation, no flourish,
only a clear line that anyone at the party could follow, from charitable donation to personal expense. People often imagine revenge as a spectacle. They imagine confetti and bursting lights and triumphant music. What I wanted was cleaner, a sequence of facts, undeniable and simple, presented in a room built by my hands. That would do more than humiliate. It would protect. It would also, I hoped, give my father a clearer picture of who had been living off his reputation.
As the plan took shape, I felt the familiar mix of adrenaline and grief. Adrenaline for the work, grief for the expected fallout. There would be conversations, there would be anger, there would be phone calls that ended with silence. But there would also be accountability, and in that possibility there was the first true feeling of relief I had felt in months. I closed my laptop and slept like a person readying for a long run, hungry, focused, a little raw. The next morning I walked into Birch with a list of names and a quiet determination. We would not make accusations without iron. We would not be mean for the sake of being mean. We would be precise and just. Wesley met me in the office with coffee that tasted like a plan. "You know this could get ugly," he said. "I know," I answered. "We keep it about facts. We keep Dad out of it as much as we can, and we make sure when the screen flips there's no doubt." He looked at me like he had seen me at my worst and my best and decided to follow. "Then let's make sure there's no doubt," he said. We began the work in the ordering way lovers of lists love. Naomi delivered spreadsheets annotated in red. Rebecca outlined the legal steps. I drafted the narrative we'd use on the slides. Plain, step by step, readable to anyone who had ever balanced a checkbook. The goal was simple: make the paper speak in a voice that even the most invested doubter couldn't ignore. There were moments when the plan felt fragile. There were nights I sat alone and thought about whether I was doing the right thing by my family. There were days I considered letting the necklace stay where it was if it meant my mother felt loved. But then I recalled the strings in the transactions that pointed away from generosity and toward self-enrichment. I thought of the people in our town who had been quietly giving because they believed in causes we had hosted, and who might, if the money was misdirected, end up with nothing. Protecting my family meant protecting my community. In that idea, I found the clarity to move forward. By the time my father's real retirement celebration came around, an invitation list curated, a menu selected, the evening slotting for sentimental speeches and careful laughter, the pieces were in place. Wesley had a copy of the master AV file in a locked drive. Naomi had enough documentation to begin drawing lines. Rebecca had drafted a legal plan for how to involve law enforcement if the evidence warranted it. I had rehearsed in my head the tone we would take: firm, factual, disinterested in spectacle. I wanted to stop the person who had bought her place at our table from thinking she could rely on appearances forever. But I also wanted my family to see that the truth doesn't only hurt, it also frees. The day before the party, I sat with my father in the same chair where he had once mended boots. He looked older in the soft light of his porch, but steady. He had his hands folded like someone listening to a hymn. "I don't know all the reasons you did what you did," he said, and I felt the question land like a coin on a table. He meant why I had left, why I had gone on to build things in cities that felt alien to him. He looked at me as if seeking a simple explanation. "Because I couldn't make a life where I felt I had to ask permission to exist," I said. It wasn't elegant, but it was true. He nodded, the way he had when he taught me to change a tire. "You always were stubborn," he said, smiling. "Stubborn kept me alive some days," I admitted. We sat in silence then, the kind that settles after confessions that don't require immediate resolution. He took a breath and then said, "The party tomorrow. Make it right. I trust you." There it was, the blessing and a kind of permission. I had it in my pocket like an extra coat. The morning of the retirement party was bright and merciless. The staff moved through last-minute adjustments with that brisk efficiency I recognized as my own. I checked the AV feed twice, then once more. Naomi emailed once with a new flag, an account that had been reported as inactive but had a transfer 2 months ago matching a donation in our files. Rebecca called to tell me she had drafted an affidavit for me to sign if needed, and that she had reached out quietly to a contact in a federal agency to inquire about the possibility of an investigation if the sums justified it. The legal net was getting woven. I stood at the back of the ballroom an hour before the guests began to arrive. The sun through the windows made the floor appear almost wet. Tables were arranged so every guest had a good view of the stage. Somewhere in the kitchen, the chefs were finishing the sauces. My father came out and took my hand. "You nervous?" he asked. "A little," I said. Then I added, "but ready." He squeezed my hand like he was sending a pilot light to warm me. "Do it right, Beth. Be fair." "I will," I promised. We both knew what fair meant in this room. It meant showing facts without malice. It meant exposing a mechanism, not people, for sport. It meant protecting a legacy, even if that legacy had been misused by others. When the guests began to file in, neighbors, former co-workers, a few dignitaries, I stood at the periphery and watched them take seats and sip champagne and practice smiles in the reflection of silverware. The woman with the necklace arrived later than most, as if timed to make an entrance. She wore the gold pendant like an ornament of predatory patience. She passed me with a gloved smile and mouthed, "Nice evening." I nodded. There was no warmth in my movement. There was, instead, the calculation of someone preparing a lesson that would be gentle, but taught with specific contours. It is not easy to hold both resolve and tenderness at once. Oftentimes, people think strength requires anger. It doesn't. Strength can be the patience to set a day, gather proof, and expose a lie in numbers that won't budge under excuses. The band hit the first chord. Microphones warmed. My father rose to speak. I stayed still, fingers folded, the hum in my ears not unlike the feeling before a runway opens. When his speech ended and applause fluttered like birds, I knew the moment was close. I felt the slight vibration in my pocket where an agent's message might pulse, or where Naomi might send a last-minute addition. And I waited, because timing is a justice in itself. The band finished the last of my father's jokes, and glasses went up again. The room was caught in that brief, suspended breath that happens between applause and plates, people holding their smiles like borrowed currency. I felt the vibration of the place under my feet, as if the floor itself was waiting for an instruction. Wesley gave me a look across the crowd, 2 slow blinks that said everything without breathing a word. He was at the right side of the stage, poised as if he belonged there because he had spent half his life making sure the stage worked. Marco, the AV tech, sat with his console like an airplane pilot who'd been awake too long. His fingers hovered over faders and menus, eyes darting to the deck where the night's photos were cued. Naomi texted a tight string of emojis, thumbs up, knife, lock. Rebecca's last message had been 2 words, "Ready when." I rose because that's what I had rehearsed in my head for days, not a melodramatic indictment, but a quiet walk into a room full of facts. My father sat down after his second toast, cheeks flushed with pride. He looked at me as if expecting a small note of ceremony, perhaps a clumsy speech about the long years of late nights and good advice. What he didn't expect was for the slides to stop serving nostalgia and start serving truth. "Before we break for cake," I said, and my voice felt simultaneously too small and exactly the size it needed to be, "I'd like to show a short, an important thing." There was a ripple, actual confusion at first, because people don't often interrupt their own parties with subpoenas. My mother tilted her head toward me like a bird of habit, checking on a child crossing the street. The woman with the necklace smiled politely as if I were about to make a joke everyone could laugh with. Marco hit a sequence, and the screen that had been cycling through black and white photos of tools and foundrymen and my father's younger gap-tooth grin switched. The slide that filled the room was simple: a bank statement excerpt, dates, amounts, and a caption in plain type: "Donations received, event dates overlap." Then another slide, 2 columns, left side showing the date of a donor dinner at the town hall, right side showing a routing of money through companies with names that read like word games: Octagon Consulting, Southern Evening LLP, ending in a deposit into a personal account. Each transfer was highlighted in yellow, arrows drawn to show the path. Nothing sensational, just lines and numbers. The effect, paradoxically, was theatrical. The room went quiet because it had to. Numbers have a cruel kind of charisma when they are arranged into meaning. Naomi had done her job so well that my stomach tightened and my mouth went dry. I had seen these sheets in my hands in the night hours, the red underlines, the annotated notes about timestamps. Presented up there in front of my family and their friends, they read like a map. "These are transactions tied to events hosted at venues affiliated with our community," I said. "Notice the dates. Every transfer coincides with an event that was billed as a community donation or sponsorship. The funds then route through intermediary companies and terminate in accounts controlled by individuals associated with tonight's guests." A murmur rose, a low, unsettled sound. The woman with the necklace shifted and swallowed whatever tired smile she had practiced. My mother clutched at the cloth on her knees as if she could anchor herself with linen. The next slide was a photo sequence, a donor dinner, the woman laughing at a table, people in tuxes raising their bobbing heads. Then a capture of an email scheduling that dinner, sent from an account that resolved to a server rented under a false name. Then a bank entry listing consulting fee at the exact same time. Side by side, the narrative assembled itself like a well-oiled machine. "Miss Whittemore?" Rebecca's voice said suddenly, crisp and clinical, and people turned toward the entrance as Agent Carla Reeves stepped forward with 2 officers at her shoulder. She wore a plain jacket and a badge clipped to her belt. Everything about her said function. "This is Agent Reeves with the Federal Investigations Unit," Rebecca announced without flourish. "We have probable cause to believe there has been a pattern of misrepresentation and diversion of funds. For that reason, we are executing arrest warrants and taking evidentiary custody." The air in the room changed color. I heard the scrape of chairs as people stood back. The woman with the necklace had gone pale as a linen napkin. She, who had introduced herself as Sloane Whitmore that afternoon, with a voice like carved glass, now looked smaller in her designer dress. The officers moved with the rehearsed gentleness of professionals whose job it is to make human beings follow factual steps, not to humiliate them. They said the words, "You are arrested," with the mechanical kindness of people who have read too many confessions already. Sloane's lips peeled back in something that was almost a shape of outrage. "This is ridiculous," she said. "You can't. This is slander." "You can speak to counsel," Agent Reeves said, "but right now we need you to come with us." The woman who'd bought my mother's admiration with a chain of gold did not leave without a fight, but no one in that room wanted a spectacle. People looked away from the scene like they were shielding themselves from a burn. My mother hadn't moved. She sat, dazed, the necklace heavy against her throat. Garrett's face had collapsed into a distracted, brittle composure. For a moment, I saw the family I had been born into, small rituals, 1,000 small compromises, the storylines that had been played back to us for decades. "Please," my father said, and his voice trembled on the final syllable. "Please tell me this is a mistake." "It isn't," I said, not to be cruel, but to put words on the shape we were all looking at. "The ledger shows a trail. Naomi will testify to the financial mapping. Rebecca coordinated with Agent Reeves because we were seeing patterns that suggested systemic misuse." I had expected uproar, and there was some, people whispering through hands, a few gasps sounding like small stones. But what surprised me most was the muted quality of it. The room seemed more stunned than theatrical. People who thought themselves moral saw the indices of moral failure move like scoreboard digits. Rebecca took control of the narrative in the small, tidy way that makes legal strategy feel like an exercise in pattern recognition. "For the press," she said, "we ask for patience. This is an active investigation. We will provide statements through appropriate channels." That was a legal firewall, yes, but also a mercy. There would be no wild accusations from the stage meant to feed tabloids. We had evidence, and we owed it to everyone present to let the law do its job. As Sloane was led away, her wrists briefly in hands that did not glare, but held, the jewelry on her hand flashed. A man, a handler of sorts, followed, mouthing reassurances into a phone. I noticed then the quiet choreography of the people who make a life of appearances. Assistants, fixers, an army of plausible deniability, all arranged like a set of props. It was a theater of illusion that had finally been called on stage and asked to reveal its rivets. My brother staggered outside into the small antechamber used for coat checks. I followed because bodies in shock tend to seek small rooms. He was breathing fast, hands in his pockets like a man trying to hold himself together. His facade of golden boy easy charm had cracked and seeped a sadness I knew but didn't often see. "What did you do?" he asked, deceptively simple. His voice had an edge I couldn't remember hearing from him. Real worry. "What did I do?" I repeated, because the question had two directions. "I showed what's been happening." "To Mom?" he said, the accusation laced with fear. "You did that to Mom." "I didn't do this to Mom," I said. "Someone used Mom. They used her affection to place themselves where they'd be believed." I tried to keep my voice even. "I didn't want to embarrass her. I wanted to stop them." He stared at me a long moment, then his jaw unclenched into something like admission. Beth, I thought that woman she was good for you all. She was polished. She made us look taller." "You wanted elevation without the work," I said, more gently than the thought deserved. "That's not your fault. It's what people buy." Garrett's face folded in on itself. "I should have known," he started, then stopped. The sentence seized and became something smaller. "I should have asked. You can't make people see their own part in things until they look hard enough." For Garrett, that look took longer than I would have liked. He flinched as if from a film reel of his own complacency. "I'm sorry," he said, then the words absurdly small and true. "Apology is the start," I said, "but there are other steps." I wanted him to learn the practical things, how to make amends without asking for pardons, how to own the mess, how to be part of the repair without trying to dominate it. We walked back into the ballroom together, and the mood had a thin, wary quality. People were talking in small groups, reading slides on their phones, trying to reconcile the faces they knew with the ledger entries they had just seen. My mother was still in her seat, hands folded, eyes wet but resolute in the bewildered way of a woman who had been made to feel part of a story she never wrote. She looked up when I returned, and for the first time that night, I saw something different in her face. Not the smugness of being admired by people's applause, but the rawness of a woman who had been used and who wanted to understand what had happened to her. Later, in a side room with accused people being processed and officers taking inventory, I watched as Agent Reeves read forms into the light. I had given her the copies of the AV master file Wesley had made, a meticulous duplication that kept a secure chain of custody. Marco had signed an affidavit about the master. Naomi had extracted the key transactions and notated unusual memo lines. Rebecca had drafted the legal language that would compel institutions to release account ownership records. We had done the technical parts of the thing we had to do, make the evidence speak in a court of law, or at least to investigators who could turn investigation into action. Sloan, whose legal name turned out to be Sandra Williams, was arrested along with 2 associates, a man who represented himself as a philanthropic liaison, and a financial intermediary who had a stack of fake corporate documents in a briefcase. They were led away with hands cuffed and faces a mix of defiance and frightened calculation. The officers read them their rights with the same flat kindness. There were detours of procedure, forms read, signatures taken, the polite but unambiguous language of custody for evidence. I watched none of it with the satisfaction of spectacle. Instead, I felt the deep, exhausted relief of someone who knows that the right pattern has been followed. Justice, or at least the potential for justice, prefers logbooks to heroics. Once the officers finished and left, the room hovered in an awkward equivalence of things. Plates half finished, a cake gone slightly stale, glasses of champagne forgotten. The party had been sliced open and the interior revealed like a cake with a bad filling. People drifted away, some to call for updates, some to tidy their lipstick and pretend the evening's purpose had not dissolved. My father found me by the window, hands trembling around a leaving glass as if it were evidence of a life he had to sort through. He looked small and older and horribly unchanged by the night's theater. He still had an honest hunger to do right. Did we do the right thing?" he asked, voice raw. "I think so," I said. "We didn't set out to break people. We set out to stop a pattern that was taking from our town. We gave the facts to the people whose job it is to sort them out." He looked like he wanted to follow that logic around to some tidy rest, but he couldn't. "Your mother. She was used," I said slowly. "She was flattered, and flattery is a powerful currency. That's not her fault." "But she gave away the necklace," he said. "That hurts me." "It hurts me too," I said, "but the necklace is just metal. What we need to do is give her back her dignity and help her understand. Let her see what happened, not as a condemnation, but as a context. She didn't know she was buying an image." He exhaled, and the breath looked like release. "Can we get it back?" "I hope so," I said. "We will have to take steps. Evidence will be processed, and if the necklace is part of their assets, it will be listed." That was the legal reality. I didn't want to promise the physical return beyond the bounds of process, but I also didn't want to deny him hope. That night, after the last officers had left, with their evidence boxes, and the manager had rebalanced deposits, and the staff had washed the platters, my mother and I had a long, private conversation in the small kitchen off the ballroom, where the lights were fluorescent and cheap. Coffee sat warm in a carafe. Her hands trembled as she poured for both of us, then set the cups down with a neatness that betrayed the tremor. "Why?" she asked, not as a challenge but as a raw inquiry. "Because people will sometimes buy the air of a thing rather than build the thing itself. They like how belonging looks." "Was I stupid?" she asked. "No. You were human. You wanted to be seen. I couldn't say, 'You were wrong,' because the thing that hurt her had been an expression of an old wound about being invisible. You wanted to feel admired, and they knew how to give that to you more quickly than someone who actually loved you for you would." She covered her face then, and I realized how young and old she could look in a moment, like the woman at a sewing machine and the one at a party, both at once. "I should have known. Your grandmother, she would have told me to look harder." Grandma did tell you when she pressed that necklace into our hands, I reminded her gently. She said, when you're ready. She didn't mean when you were ready to be dazzled, she meant when you were ready to see what you owned. Silence settled between us like a shared glove. We were both inventorying regrets and small acts of love disguised as shame. I'm sorry I gave it away, she said finally. I wanted to be part of something. I know, I said, and I meant it. That apology landed like a key in a lock. It didn't fix everything, but it opened a door. The necklace, as it happened, was recovered as part of the evidence cataloging. It had been included in a collection of items agents seized from Sloane's apartment, a fact that was both vindication and a hollow comfort. The paperwork read the way legal things do. Exhibit 12, gold necklace, documentary chain of custody confirmed. When I held the necklace later, it felt cold and small, and exactly what it had always been, a weight of family and promise. My mother cried when it was brought back to her. There were words we used then that don't help much in reconstruction. I'm sorry, I love you. But actions mattered more than any verbiage. She agreed to start seeing a therapist, someone the family would help find. It wasn't a dramatic conversion scene, it was a practical, adult step. She wanted to understand how she'd been manipulated. She wanted to learn to be guarded in ways that didn't make her hard. Her voice in the weeks that followed was softer, not because she'd been subdued, but because she had found a new honesty that replaced performance. Garrett, for his part, did the thing that people who want to rebuild do awkwardly. He offered to help. He apologized in fits and starts, practiced earnestness, volunteered at local charities in a way that felt less like image correction and more like actual service. It was clumsy at first. He missed some opportunities where humility mattered and flailed. But over months, he settled into a more useful earnestness. There were community meetings that followed the scandal. People who had donated money asked hard questions. Boards that had once met in comfortable anonymity began to institute audits. Some longtime donors left in anger, and some returned when they saw that the money would now be subject to oversight. The town's philanthropic life didn't collapse. It rearranged itself, not always gracefully, but with an intention I approved of. The legal aftermath was procedural and merciless in its practicalities. The press, of course, wanted a narrative, someone to champion the small-town hero or the big-city villain. We were careful with statements. Rebecca managed the releases with a steadiness that kept us out of opportunistic headlines. Agent Reeves was exact in public comments. Arrests had been made, the investigation continued, and charges were pending. Those last words are slow as glaciers. They carry potential rather than closure. I kept my satisfaction tempered by the knowledge that the law is a slow instrument, often imperfect and never one for indulgence. Through the months that followed, I worked on things that were ordinary and therefore worth doing. I signed affidavits. I sat for interviews in front of investigators who asked the same practical question twice, so their notes matched. Naomi compiled and testified to the forensic analysis she'd done, the trail of transactions, the unusual vendor memos, the shell companies. Her work was precise and unnoticed except when it mattered the most, in courtrooms and in agency files. I thanked her by taking her to lunch and telling her I didn't think anyone in our town knew precisely how much they'd done. She laughed and said she was in it for numbers, not gratitude, but she took the plate of lemon meringue like a woman who had earned it. Wesley went back to running operations like a man with a wound stitched tight. He handled the media contacts with a practicality that made me proud. He signed a formal letter affirming the integrity of the AV feed, then went back to the kitchen and checked stock levels like a priest testing the oil lamps for ritual. I rewarded him with a small raise and the knowledge that he could call me with anything, an open line, not a ledger. As for my father, he weathered the indignity with a quiet that was both stubborn and soft. He spoke at a later town hall, not as an advocate for scandal, but as a man who wanted to remind people that legacy isn't about appearances. "Work builds the world," he said, voice hoarse. "And the work is what we should honor, not those who swagger on borrowed money." The necklace eventually returned to a place with a new story attached. We decided together, in an odd, reconciliatory conversation, to make Grandma's necklace the centerpiece of a small scholarship, the Burns Heritage Scholarship. It was modest and practical and in keeping with the kind of restitution that fits people who had been wounded and wanted to do something constructive rather than symbolic. The terms were clear. The scholarship would support a young woman from our county seeking a hospitality degree. It felt right. The necklace, once used as a prop to buy social capital, now became a symbol to pay forward opportunity. Nicole Patterson was the first recipient. She'd been a barback at a local inn when I first noticed her, efficient, sharp-eyed, always finding an extra roll of silverware when a tray faltered. When I told her about the scholarship, she cried in a way that made me proud and nervous at once. There was something pure in her gratitude that had nothing to do with scandal and everything to do with the honoring of work. I sat across the table from her on a chilly morning and wrote the first check in a modest kitchen at Birch, sealing it with a handshake and a promise that we'd mentor her through her first internship. Mentorship turned out to be easier than people expect. It is mostly logistics and attention. I introduced Nicole to managers. I sat down with her to review budgets and taught her how to read a P&L without flinching. I told her what I had wished someone had told me, that there is power in showing up early and in the way you answer your phone. I did not romanticize the grind. I told her plainly about the nights I'd slept on a cot at the back of a banquet hall. She listened and did not wave it away. Instead, she planned. There were interviews after the arrests. Local papers wanted that bittersweet angle of family drama turned to civic cleansing. I declined most requests. I gave one sit-down interview, the transcript of which Rebecca approved before it went out. My talking points were simple. Accountability matters. Communities must insist on transparency. People deserve the chance to repair. I refused to turn the story into a serial triumph. It was not mine to claim beyond the role I had played. Some folks in town still kept their distance from my mother, a small old wound that takes time to heal. Others returned to help with harvest dinners and civic fundraising. The pattern of our social life rearranged itself around new lines of trust. I watched it like a gardener watches bulbs after the frost. Sometimes things resprout brighter, sometimes they don't come back. In our case, most things came back in altered hues. Months passed and court dates were set, procedural steps that do not make dramatic copy so much as create a slow arc toward resolution. Charges were filed against several people, others were under continued investigation. I stopped saying them as if the conspiracy were faceless. The legal process required naming names and letting process unfold. Even in that procedural slowness, there was a satisfaction in seeing systems respond to clear evidence. Back in my office, framed news clippings began to appear on the wall. They were small, practical reminders of what had happened, not trophies for a mantle. I kept one nearby that read, "Local owner exposes fraud," next to a black and white photo of my father in his workshop. My desk looked the way it had since the first year. Paperweight, ledger, a mug that read, "Keep the lights on." There was the sense, finally, of a life that balanced both the small and the structural, soup in the pot and the plan in the binder. A year later, we held a small, quieter celebration for my father at the community center. No chandeliers this time, only folding chairs and lemon pie. He'd been asked to be on a panel about work ethics, and he spoke in that honest voice that seems to find the best in difficult things. My mother gave a small speech about humility and learning. Garrett had a part in organizing a community barbecue. It was not a dramatic reconciliation scene. Rather, it was a chain of small acts that pointed in the same direction, to keep trying. Nicole graduated from her program with a certificate and an internship at Birch. On the day of her award, we pinned the scholarship ribbon to a corkboard in my office. She hugged me then, not as if I had saved her life, but as if I had helped her afford the chance to do what she loved. That was enough. Sometimes people treat vindication like a prize you clutch. I don't. Vindication is quieter when it's real. It comes as the steady flattening of things that once chafed under your skin. It is watching a policy change at a nonprofit you helped found. It is breakfast with your father on a Wednesday when no photographers are anywhere nearby. It is calling Naomi and making dinner plans because you both have time to breathe. There were small but necessary conversations with neighbors and vendors who had been confused about the donor's money. I re-examined contracts, tightened oversight at Birch, instituted transparent donation reporting for events hosted by our venues. We set up an anonymous reporting line for irregular donations and added independent auditors to our boards. These were not grand gestures, they were the practical administration of trust. In time, the town began to call less, and the days returned to their rhythms. People stopped asking me for a blow-by-blow account. The memory of that night softened into something educative rather than sensational. Sloane's name lingered in news cycles for a while, due to filings and hearings. The legal system had its steps, and we let it do its work. I felt the small satisfaction of having held my nerve through the tactics designed to change my mind. Offers to buy silence, men calling with charmingly veiled threats, lawyers with smiles that read as blandness. I stood firm because the ledger had taught me the arithmetic of responsibility and because my father deserved the clarity of truth. On a damp, late afternoon, I sat at my desk and opened a letter from an old friend, someone from my first hotel opening, who had read about the case and wanted to offer a quiet note. She said, in tidy handwriting, "You kept your promise." I folded the paper and looked at the framed photo of my first opening day, and allowed a small smile that had nothing to do with being right and everything to do with having stayed true to an inner compass. If there's a lesson to this, if the story needs one that keeps its measure, it's that patience and precision yield an honesty that's hard to argue with. Let people perform their roles while you keep documents, keep copies, keep a ready lawyer and a forensics person, and a steady general manager. Hold compassion for those who were used, even while you push for accountability for those who used them. The awkward balance between justice and mercy is less a line and more a craft. Now, months later, when I attend community events, I watch people differently. I see the way charm can paper over a missing ledger, and I also see the people who show up at sunrise to sweep the town's sidewalks. I lend my attention to the latter. I put an intern on the roster who wants to learn how to run a small venue, and I teach her how to read a cash flow. I let people into opportunities rather than into my anger. On a Tuesday, I met Nicole at the small cafe downtown where we both ate the regular soup for lunch. She was wearing a crisp shirt that said she was proud, not posed, and she talked about a new event she wanted to try, a fundraiser for vocational scholarships. I listened and offered a small seed fund, not to control the project, but to seed it. When we walked out of the cafe, she tucked her hair behind her ear and said, "You changed my life, Ms. Burns." I shook my head and answered, "We changed your opportunity. The rest is you." When I lean back in my chair now and look out at the window at my office, at the 3 oaks that always threaten the mailbox, I often return to the same private understanding I had in the ballroom. the quiet competence of someone who builds things. There is an ease to living that way, not a smugness, but a kind of economy with feelings. You save your outrage for facts, and your tenderness for people. There's also something else I choose, to protect the people who were hurt. My mother, now in therapy, has a new steadiness. She still likes to be seen, but she has begun to enjoy being simply present without the costume. Garrett keeps a low profile but calls often, asking how to do things the right way instead of the quick one. My father, when he visits the hotel, sits quietly at the back and watches the staff folding napkins with the respect of a man who recognizes work. On my office wall hangs a small card my grandmother wrote decades ago. It reads in her looping script, "Do good work, the rest will follow." I keep that card where I see it often, not because it is epigraphic wisdom, but because it was the last honest thing she gave me, the one that never smelled of performance. There are nights I still think about the woman in the pale heels. Sometimes I wonder whether she will find real work that doesn't require a costume. I hope she will. Vengeance is a brittle friend. Repair is the harder, more honest task. The legal system will handle consequences in its own pace. My job was to be a witness who brought evidence into a public space so those consequences could be administered fairly. If there is a single image I keep returning to, one that makes the title of this whole mess feel more like a lesson than an accusation, it is of the chandelier's crystals catching light that afternoon. They flashed like small, perfect points of truth. People were throwing their best faces into the room, but beneath those faces, work and stewardship and quiet competence were doing the actual holding. I think of the title now. They mocked me at my father's retirement party, then one reveal shut them all up, and I feel its shape. If I were to say anything with a flourish, I'd resist the cheap catharsis of the phrase, "shut them up."